All right, well, thanks for joining today to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is early planted soybeans. And really, early is not so much as important as timely. We always want to plant soybeans in a timely manner when soil conditions are right. But from a yield standpoint, we see generally higher soybean yields when they are planted earlier in the growing season. And along with early planting dates come several really important management considerations. So, what is early? We've been doing research with Ohio Soybean Council on a project looking at various soybean planting dates. We call them ultra early as our earliest planting date. And this is before the early crop insurance planting date. So in Ohio, this would be late March to early April. And then we're looking at just early planting dates. This is right around that crop insurance date in the state, which is mid-April or so, and then normal planting dates. So this would be early to that mid-May timeframe. So planting dates are really important, not only to maximize yield, but also trying to mitigate some of this risk due to bad weather. So in Ohio specifically, we know our planting window is really small. Um, Between mid-April and mid-May, on average, we only have half of those days suitable for field work. So this would be planting, herbicide application, any tillage that you'd want to do, a very small amount of time to do all of that in the spring because of wet weather conditions. And that planting window is getting smaller each year. So we know that timing is important, but also our planting window is really narrow. And we also need to plant corn during that same time frame. So sometimes soybeans have to be planted earlier than ideal or later than ideal just because our growing window is so compressed in Ohio. But we do know that soybean can lose about a half bushel per acre per day for each day soybeans are planted after the end of April. It's also important to look at your crop insurance dates when you are considering when to plant soybeans. These were recently revised a couple years ago. And so for Ohio, our early crop insurance planting date is about 10 days earlier than what it was previously. So in the very southern part of the state, this date is April 5th. And then going north in Ohio, that date is April 15th. But planting date is also affects a lot of factors, not only yield, but we also need to consider insects, diseases, weeds, and all kinds of other factors that interact with planting dates. So those management considerations that we need to keep our eye out for. The first one is low plant population, and this is very consistent with our research in Ohio. When we plant soybeans early, there's all kinds of stressors, both abiotic stressors, so wet, cold type of conditions, and biotic stressors, so diseases, insects, slugs. And because of all of these factors, we oftentimes see our soybean plant population lower than maybe a more timely planting date or a later planting date in May. So soybeans, we like to see at least 100,000 plants per acre at harvest, but many times with those early planted soybean fields, we'll see lower plant populations because of these risk factors. And because these soybean plants are planted early, they will grow slowly, and that will also delay canopy closure. So one common consideration when you plant soybeans early is whether or not those plants should be replanted or repair planted, which means you already have a thin stand and you go back and plant over top of that thin stand. So that can be a very challenging consideration for farmers. If possible, we recommend farmers doing a stand count before they decide to replant. And if they can, wait till at least the V1 or V2 growth stage, they can get a more accurate count of their plant population. This is a picture from Ohio where a farmer planted early and just waited and waited and waited for the soybean plants to come up, and they were slow because it was cold. and he got nervous, and so he replanted before the plants came up, and he actually ended up with double the plant stand because eventually those early ones did come up. But when you plant early, things will move around slowly, and that can be really concerning when you're pondering whether or not to replant your field. So I mentioned taking a stand count is important. We like to see 100,000 plants per acre as a minimum, but we know in Ohio you can have 70,000 plants per acre, 80,000 plants per acre, and still achieve maximum yield or near maximum yield. Doing this not too early is important because those plants will come out of the ground slowly. So if you can wait to that V1 stage, that is good. We tend to try to count the number of plants in 1/1000th of an acre. So if you plant soybeans in 15-inch rows, which are common in Ohio, we count 17 feet 5 inches of row in 2 rows, and that gives us 1/1000th of an acre. So for example, if we count 80 plants in those 2 rows that are 17 feet 5 inches long, that would be 80,000 plants per acre as an estimate. But again, in terms of yield, even though we would like to see 100,000, if we're down in that 70 to 80,000 plant per acre area, generally you can still achieve good yields. So I mentioned abiotic stressors as one factor that reduces plant populations in the spring when we plant early. Those could include flood, rain, storms, just saturated soil conditions. This picture here of soybeans sitting in mud is not an uncommon sight in Ohio. We see this a lot. And then freeze damage is something we can also experience when we plant soybeans early. Last year on March 25th, we planted soybeans in Western Ohio. Then we had a freeze event the end of April, and our soybeans were damaged. The ones that were out of the ground, the growing point died, and plant was lost. So there's different levels of freeze damage that we can see in soybeans. So this was a few years ago, but we saw moderate frost damage in our South Charleston location. This is West Central Ohio, where you can see the cotyledons have they're a little bit burned because of the frost. But as long as that growing point doesn't die, that plant will live. So it may not look pretty, but these plants all survived. But if you have damage to the growing point or below the growing point right here on the hypocotyl, that plant will die. So we recommend assessing your soybean fields a few days after freeze damage, not right away, so you can see the extent of the damage. Drought is something we can also see in Ohio. This was a few years ago, but planting into dry conditions can slow emergence and be challenging for farmers. We also see soil crusting. So this is when someone would plant and then get heavy rainfall and drying conditions, and that soil crusts over. And this can reduce your plant population because that plant just can't get out of the ground. And this is from Northwest Ohio, where they have more clay or silty clay type of soils. Moving on to biotic stressors, so these are more your insects or slugs or diseases. We do see bean leaf beetle issues in Ohio when we plant early. The picture here, again, these are from our planting date research last year in West Central Ohio. This first set of soybeans here were planted on March 25th, and the second set was planted on April 16th. What's interesting is we almost have a 3-week difference there with planting dates, but the soybeans are about the same size because those early ones took so long to emerge and come out of the soil. But what you'll notice is that there are more of these holes or defoliation on the leaves of our early planted soybeans, and those are associated with bean leaf beetle. So those really early planted soybeans exhibited more bean leaf beetle damage than our later planted soybeans, and these were April 16th. The early ones sat in the ground for a long time. It was wet, And so some of that insecticide seed treatment may have not been effective anymore because of the length of time that seed just sat in the wet soil conditions. Slugs is another thing we can see. I haven't seen too much of this in my trials recently, but in the past I have seen slug damage. This is more in northeastern Ohio, where we had a field that was planted really early. There was no tillage, and we also had a cover crop. So a lot of factors that make a nice environment for slugs, but slugs can cause significant reduction in plant populations in Ohio. Seed corn maggot is an insect we've also seen. This was in northeast Ohio a couple years ago in our early planted soybeans. My student was digging soybean plants to check for germination, and then she dug up this soybean cotyledon, and it had a seed corn maggot on it. And this again goes back to that seed treatment where we planted early, it was really wet, and that insecticide seed treatment may not have been effective that long due to the time that the soybean was just in the ground. Weeds are also very problematic. I mentioned earlier that we can have good soybean yields at a lower plant population, but if you have a lower plant population, your canopy closure is going to be slower. And if you have slower canopy closure, then your weeds can be very competitive. And so if you have low plant populations, having a good weed control program is going to be really, really important. In our research, we've seen that pre-emergent herbicides cannot be used for season-long control. They can be a useful tool, but they're not going to help with control of weeds for the whole season. And you may need multiple post-emergence herbicide applications to give you that season-long control, just because those soybean plants grow very slowly and canopy closure will be slow. So some more recommendations. Planting early is important to maximize yield. We generally see our higher yields with those earlier planting dates, but also make sure you keep that crop insurance planting date in mind for your county. Right now, our recommendation for soybean is to plant at that crop insurance date for your county if your soil moisture conditions allow. So in some years, we know we're at that crop insurance date, maybe of April 10th for the county, but it's wet. And if that's the case, don't plant. But if soil conditions allow, that's a good guideline based on our research. And then we do see soybean yields decrease quite a bit as planting date is delayed. In general, yields will be maintained till about the end of April, early May, mid-May, and then decline very quickly once we get to the end of May and into June. So we have some resources that are useful when you're thinking about planting dates or soybean management. The trial I talked about today, we call Battle for the Belt. It's really comparing different soybean planting dates to different corn planting dates, because we know both crops are planted at the same time, and it's interesting to see how both crops respond to the same planting dates and same environmental conditions. And we have a YouTube series on that. We release a video weekly throughout the summer. So that comes out about every Tuesday. Science for Success is another great resource. Science for Success is comprised of soybean specialists like myself across the US, and we represent close to 90% of the soybean production areas across the country. So we have a lot of videos and fact sheets related to soybeans. And of course, Ohio Soybean Council resources are really important to keep in mind. Soy Ohio, and then also Ohio Field Leader. So with that, I want to thank Ohio Soybean Council, for funding a lot of this research. They funded Battle for the Belt and also our weed control studies looking at early planted soybeans. So of course, we're always very appreciative of farmers' support for our research.